This is the Ink Therapist. Real talk about healing, bodies, and the world we're actually living in. Welcome to the Ink Therapist. Before we get started, a quick reminder. I'm a licensed therapist, but listening to this podcast does not create a therapist-client relationship between us. The information shared here is for educational and entertainment purposes only and shouldn't replace professional mental health care. If you're in crisis or need personalized support, please reach out to a licensed mental health provider in your area or contact a crisis or warm line. And with that, let's jump in. I want to start with a question. When was the last time you were fully relaxed? Not in the bed with your eyes closed relaxed, not technically on vacation relaxed. I mean actually in your body. No background hum of alertness, no part of you running a quiet threat assessment on the room, fully at ease. Take a second with that. If that question is hard to answer, if you genuinely can't remember, or if fully relaxed sounds like something that happens to other people, this episode is for you. And if you immediately answered, oh, never, with a kind of dark humor that covered something real, this episode is especially for you. Welcome back to the Ink Therapist. I'm Del Knight, they, them, licensed psychotherapist, somatic therapist, certified body trust specialist, and the person who is going to spend the next hour talking to you about your nervous system in a way that I hope feels less like a clinical explanation and more like finally having a name for something you've been carrying for a long time. This is episode 1. Last time we talked about who this show is for and what it's going to sound like, and today we get into the actual work. The topic is chronic vigilance. And I want to say right at the top, if you have never heard this phrase before, I want you to stay with me, because I think by the end of this episode, you are going to recognize it in yourself, in people you love, in patterns you've been trying to explain for years without quite having the words. Let's go. So what is chronic vigilance? Let me describe something and see if it sounds familiar. You walk into a room, any room, a party, a waiting room, a new workplace. And before you consciously registered anything, some part of you has already scanned it, noting the exits, clocking who's there, making a quick read on the energy, filed away who seems safe and who doesn't. You do this without deciding to. It happens before the thinking part of your brain has caught up. Or you're having a perfectly fine day. Nothing is actually wrong. And there's still a hum, a background frequency of waiting, like you're bracing for something you can't name. Or someone close to you is in a good mood, and instead of just enjoying it, part of you is quietly monitoring it, tracking whether it might shift, waiting for the version of this moment that goes sideways. Or you can't sleep. Not because you're not tired, you're exhausted, but because your body won't settle. Like it hasn't gotten the memo that it's okay to stop for a few hours. That hum, that scan, that low-level readiness that never quite turns off, that's chronic vigilance. Here's the clinical frame. Vigilance is your nervous system's threat detection system. It's one of the most ancient and important things your body does. When there's real danger, when something actually threatening is happening, your nervous system mobilizes. It sharpens your attention, it activates your stress response, it prepares you to act. This is not a malfunction. This is a feature. The problem, if we're going to call it a problem, is what happens when the system never gets the signal that it's okay to power down. For most people, the threat response is meant to be episodic. Something scary happens, the system fires, you respond, The threat passes and the system settles. You come back to baseline. Chronic vigilance is what happens when the system stops settling, when the baseline itself becomes a state of readiness, when your nervous system, for reasons we're going to get into, has decided that staying alert is the safer bet. Now, I want to say something important here before we go any further. Chronic vigilance gets pathologized a lot. It shows up in the DSM language as hypervigilance, which is a symptom of PTSD and several anxiety-related diagnoses. And I'm not saying this framing is wrong, but I am saying it's incomplete. Because when we only ever talk about vigilance as a symptom, as something that's wrong with you, we skip right past the most important question. What was your nervous system responding to? Because it was responding to something. That's what I want to spend the next part of our conversation on. How chronic vigilance develops. Your nervous system is, at its core, a prediction machine. It is constantly, mostly below the level of your conscious awareness, taking in information from an environment and your history and running a kind of probability calculation. What do I need to do right now to keep this person safe? And it learns. That's the part that's crucial to understand. Your nervous system learns from experience. It builds a model of the world based on what has actually happened to you. And it uses that model to predict what's likely to happen next. When your history has included significant threat, a home that wasn't safe, a community that wasn't safe, systems that treated you as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be supported, loss, violence, ongoing stress that has no resolution, your nervous system builds a model that reflects that history. It doesn't build an idealized model of how the world should work. It builds an accurate model of how the world has actually worked for you. And in a world where threats have been real, consistent, and sometimes unpredictable, a nervous system that stays alert is not overreacting. It's doing its job. I want to spend a minute on the word adaptation because I think it matters. Chronic vigilance is not a sign that something went wrong inside you. It's a sign that your nervous system is very good at what it was designed to do, which is keep you alive and functioning inside the conditions of your actual life. The child who learned to read the room before they walked in the door, who could tell by the sound of footsteps in the hallway whether it was going to be a safe night, that child's nervous system was doing something extraordinary. It was tracking patterns. It was building a survival map. That child grew up. The footsteps changed, but the nervous system, which doesn't automatically update just because the calendar does, kept running the same map because that map worked. Because it kept them safe when safe was hard to come by. This is not pathology. This is wisdom that has outlasted the circumstances that required it. Now, I want to be honest about something because I think good therapy requires honesty, even when the honesty thing is complicated. Chronic vigilance causes real suffering. I'm not here to romanticize it or tell you it's actually fine. The exhaustion of never fully resting, the relationships that are hard to inhabit because part of you is always monitoring the exits, the way the world can feel simultaneously overwhelming and just slightly out of reach. That's real. That matters. That deserves care. But, and this is the part that changes everything about how we approach healing, the care looks very different depending on whether we're starting from a something is wrong with you or your system learned this for good reasons, and now we're going to work with it together. The first framing puts you in combat with your own nervous system. The second puts you in relationship with it. I know which one I've seen produce better outcomes, and I know which ones I'd want someone to offer me. Who carries this and why? I want to talk about who carries chronic vigilance, and I want to be specific because I think specificity is more honest than generality. Anyone can develop chronic vigilance in response to sustained threat. It is not specific to any one community or identity. But I also want to name clearly that some bodies, some communities, some identities have lived and are living inside conditions of chronic threat that are structural, that are built into systems, that are not individual experiences of bad luck, but collective experience of deliberate design. And the mental health field has not always been honest about that distinction. For trans and non-binary people, we are living inside a moment in which our existence is being actively legislated against, in which basic access to healthcare, to safety, to public life is being contested in courtrooms and legislatures in real time. That is not anxiety without cause. That is a nervous system responding to an actual, ongoing, documented threat. The hypervigilance that shows up in trans bodies, the constant environmental scanning, the reading of every new space for safety signals, the bracing before you correct someone's pronoun, the way you do a quiet risk assessment before you walk into a bathroom, this is not anxiety disorder. This is an accurate threat response to real conditions. And I want to say this clearly. A therapist who treats that vigilance as a symptom to be reduced without naming the conditions that created it is doing an incomplete work at best. For queer people, more broadly, the experience of growing up in a world that pathologizes your identity, that may have included family rejection, religious harm, or social exclusion, those experiences leave marks. The nervous system learns. And for many queer people, the vigilance around authenticity, the hyper-awareness of who is safe to be yourself with, the reflexive monitoring of how much of yourself you're showing is a direct inheritance of those experiences. For people of color, and particularly for Black people in the United States, the research on racial trauma and its nervous system effects is substantial and still growing. The concept of racial battle fatigue, the documented impact of chronic exposure to racism, both interpersonal and systemic, on stress hormones, cardiovascular health, mental health. The particular vigilance of moving through systems that were built on your exclusion and that continue to function as if safety, your safety, is optional. This is not metaphor. This is generational trauma. This is biology responding to a social reality. For neurodivergent people, a world that was not designed for how your brain works is a world that requires constant, exhausting translation, code switching, masking, monitoring, the work of performing neurotypicality in neurotypical spaces is its own form of chronic vigilance. And the burnout that follows is real and often misunderstood and deserves to be named as what it is: the cost of sustained adaptation to an environment that doesn't fit. For people who grew up in homes and communities where love and harm lived in the same person, where the person who was supposed to protect you was also the source of threat, the nervous system that learned to track mood, read silences, and preempt anger is a nervous system that did extraordinary work to keep you safe. It doesn't always know when you've left that room. I say all of this not to produce a list of oppressions and move on. I say it because I think we cannot talk honestly about chronic vigilance without talking about what produces it. And because I think the individualization of nervous system responses, the treatment of vigilance as a personal problem rather than a reasonable response to collective conditions, is itself a form of harm. Your nervous system is not broken. It is responding to data. And the question, the one that healing gets to ask, is not, how do we make you less reactive? It's, how do we help you build enough safety that your system has evidence it can sometimes rest? That's a different question, and it opens up very different work. What healing actually looks like. Okay, let's talk about what healing from chronic vigilance actually looks like. Because I think there's a version of this that gets sold in therapy, in wellness culture, in certain kinds of self-help that I want to push back on. The version I mean is this: heal your trauma, resolve your anxiety, and then you'll be calm, regulated person who doesn't get triggered anymore. This is not what healing looks like. At least not in my experience of it, and not in what I've witnessed in over a decade of doing this work. What healing actually looks like is more range. Let me explain that. There's a concept in trauma therapy called the window of tolerance. I'll do a whole episode on this. It's next, actually, but the short version is this. Think about a zone. Inside that zone, you can feel things, even difficult, uncomfortable things, without being overwhelmed by them. You can be present, you can think, you can connect, you can experience some range of emotion without losing your footing. Above that zone is too much, the hyper-activated state where everything is flooded, where the threat response is fully online, where you might be in panic or rage or dissociation. Below it is too little, the shutdown state, where you've gone flat, where you're numb, where you're watching your life from outside of it. Chronic vigilance narrows that window. It pushes you towards the edges, things that a settled nervous system could handle in the middle of the zone to send you flying out of it. The work of healing chronic vigilance is not about turning off the response. It's about widening the window, about giving your nervous system more evidence over time and in a safe context. That there is a middle zone and that you can live there more of the time. In somatic work, the body-centered approach I practice, this happens through what we call titration. Titration is a chemistry term. It means introducing something in very small, carefully measured doses. And in somatic therapy, it means we don't ask your nervous system to process everything at once. We work at the edges of what's tolerable. We touch something difficult, and then we come back. We let the system integrate before we go further. This is the opposite of the breakthrough model on therapy that you'll see dramatized in film and television. The one where the person has a cathartic sob in session and then they're healed. That model, I'll say directly, can actually be re-traumatizing because the nervous system can't integrate what it's flooded with. It can only integrate what it can tolerate. Slow is not a consolation prize. Slow is actually how it works. And then there's something I want to name that I think is under-discussed in therapeutic literature on vigilance, which is the goal is not to produce a person who no longer has threat detection. Threat detection is useful. The ability to read a room, to sense when something is off, to notice what other people miss, these are gifts that often come with nervous systems that have been finely tuned by necessity. I've worked with clients whose hypervigilance, when it was no longer an overdrive, became a kind of exquisite attunement, an extraordinary sensitivity to other people, to environments, to what is unsaid in a room. We're not here to send that away. We're here to give some company, to build enough of a middle range that the vigilance becomes one mode your system can access rather than the only mode it knows. So what does this look like practically? It looks like learning to notice what happens in your body, not immediately fix it, but to develop a relationship with it, to get curious about the tension in your shoulders before you try to make it stop, to acknowledge the hum of alertness when it's there rather than overriding it with productivity or substances or dissociation. It looks like building new experiences of safety, slowly, deliberately, in contexts that are actually trustworthy. Not rushing to reframe the belief that the world is dangerous, but accumulating actual evidence in your body, not just your thinking, that some places are different. And it looks like grieving, because there is grief in this work. For the years your body spent in high alert, for the relationships that were hard to inhabit, for the version of childhood or adolescence or early adulthood or all three that a body in survival mode doesn't get to fully experience. It looks like moving at a pace your nervous system can actually tolerate, which is often slower than you think it should be going, which is okay, which is in fact the work. I want to say one more thing before we move toward the close. Healing from chronic vigilance is not linear. I want to name that explicitly because I think the expectation of linearity, the sense that you should be getting steadily better, that a setback means you're doing it wrong, is one of the things that most undermines people in this work. These sessions that feel like enormous movement happen. And then there are sessions that feel like you mostly just got to breathe for an hour. Both count. Both are the work. And the weeks where your window narrows again, when something in your world or in your life activates the system that's been learning to settle, those are not failures. They are information. They are your nervous system telling you what it still needs. Work with that. Don't fight it. All right. I want to leave you with something to take with you from this episode. No homework, no technique, just a question to sit with. Think about a version of vigilance you carry, the particular way your nervous system stays ready, the specific things it monitors, and the particular flavor of the hum. And instead of asking, how do I make this stop, which is a reasonable question and one we'll keep working with, try asking, what was this protecting me from? What did this make possible? What did it allow you to survive, to navigate, to get through? You don't have to have an answer. The question itself does something. It moves the relationship from combat to curiosity. And in my experience, curiosity is where healing begins. If this episode landed for you, if you heard yourself in any of what I described today, I want you to know that there's support available for this kind of work. At Soma Roots Therapy, I work with people whose nervous systems have learned vigilance in a way of surviving. We go slowly. We follow your lead. We don't pathologize your body learning what your body learned to do. We work with it. I am accepting new clients in Oregon and Washington starting July 2026. I accept a variety of commercial insurances. I offer a sliding scale. You can learn more and reach out at somarootstherapy.com. The link is in the show notes. And no pressure, no rush. That's kind of our whole philosophy. The companion blog post to this episode is live on the website. It covers the same material in a format you can read, save, or share. It's also in the show notes. Next episode, we're going into the window of tolerance, what it actually is, what happens to it in under sustained threat, and what somatic therapy does to widen it. It's the clinical frame that underlines almost everything I do, and I want to make it as accessible and practical as I can. Thank you for being here. Thank you for taking this slow with me. I'm Del Knight. This is the Ink Therapist. Slow down, feel it, root deeper. See you next time.